everyone. I hope you're all having a good Memorial Day weekend if you're in the States and just having a pleasant Sunday otherwise. I came across this essay in the New York Times, and I thought if anyone had any interest in systems biology or network medicine or just emergent properties and how they relate to chronic disease in general, it might be interesting. So, this article is talking about the interstitium, and it says that some discoveries change the way we view the human body. In 2021, researchers described what they saw when they had examined skin biopsy samples that included tattoos. The ink particles traveled deeper than anticipated through interstitial spaces in the tissue underneath the skin or the fascia. This wasn't supposed to happen, Neil Bies, a professor of pathology at New York University and a senior author of the paper reporting the results, told me. The existence of an apparent conduit between skin and the fascia beneath it, two tissue layers not known to connect with each other in this way, broke accepted anatomic boundaries. The researchers also found that the same was true for other previously unknown microscopic connections between organs in the abdomen. That interstitial space exists in and under the skin and between and around the body's organs and had been observed going back more than a century, but we but they were assumed to exist in isolation from one another, like a patchwork quilt. Thies and his colleagues published their first observations of these spaces in 2018, and their findings in 2022 in a tattoo ink study implied that the body's interstitial spaces were parts of a vast interconnected whole, what scientists now call the interstitium. This is clearly a third bodily system for the circulation of fluids, in addition to cardiovascular and lymphatic systems, according to Rebecca Wells, a professor of medicine at UPenn. The human body suddenly looked less like a patchwork quilt and more like a knitted blanket. The implications of a new circulatory system for our health and for the understanding of our bodies are potentially enormous. I just thought that it was interesting that they had this actual animation done because I think the interstitium is something that has been a little bit esoteric thus far. We know that it's good at connecting different organs together, but we haven't really elucidated how that crosstalk happens. Thus far, we do know a lot about the crosstalk between the gut microbiome, the intestinal lining of the gut, and other organs. For example, the enteric nervous system is the part of the nervous system that exists along the lining of the gut. So we're not completely ignorant of crosstalk among systems, but I think the interstitium or the discovery of the interstitium adds another layer to that. For 400 years, anatomists have understood there to be two systems in the body that function as transportation networks for cells, electrolytes, nutrients, and hormones: the lymphatic system and the cardiovascular system. The lymphatic system, which removes excess fluid from tissues, was observed as early as 1622 by the Italian physician Gasperi Aselli when he vivisected a dog. What's interesting is that initially we didn't know that there were actually lymph nodes in the brain and nervous system, and the um, the the visualizer, Ramoni Cajal, he could not actually visualize these. And so it was assumed that there aren't any lymphatic systems in the brain and nervous system. But we did actually discover them back in 2015. So it's a relatively recent discovery. And so that led to the coining of the term glymphatic. So it's GLYMPHATIC. And so that refers to the lymph nodes that are specifically in the nervous system. So we're still discovering new things even today. The workings of the cardiovascular system, in which the heart pumps blood through arteries, capillaries, and veins, were first described in 1862 by English physician and anatomist William Harvey. We have also known more. We have also known, starting with its description more than a century ago by an American anatomist and pathologist named Franklin Mall, that fibrous connective tissue enwraps and undergirds the internal structures in the human body: organs, nerves, blood vessels, bone, muscle. And for anyone who has dealt with connective tissues disorders or things like Ehlers-Danlos or Marfan syndrome, anything that affects the integrity of connective tissue, this is obviously a well-known fact that having a lack of integrity with connective tissue, it doesn't just affect bones and muscle and tissue. It also has effects on the nervous system. It can cause dysautonomia. It can also affect immune function and mast cell degranulation. So connective tissue is definitely one of those things that can have far-reaching effects if it's not developing normally. The ubiquitous fibrous tissue, the fascia, functions in the body the way the way studs frame the rooms in a house, but these studs and interstitial spaces inside them weren't thought to be interconnected within and between organs to form an interstitium network until Thies and Wells's study was published. To get a sense of the inside of the interstitium, Wells suggests picturing a sheet of chicken wire embedded in a gel. The chicken wire represents collagen, a type of protein. Inside the interstitium, bundles of collagen interlock with one another, providing strength and structure. The sponge-like gel, able to absorb and store water, is made from hyaluronic acid and fills the spaces between the collagen bundles. Fluid gels and other molecules slowly flow through this gel. In this new view of the body's interstitial spaces, these microscopic areas connect to one another within a larger web, through which fluid moves before re entering the lymphatic and cardiovascular systems, like groundwater flowing through the Earth's crust before returning to the surface in springs and rivers. These Wells and colleagues were praised by their scientific peers for their findings. The work was really comprehensive, says David Merrick, an assistant professor of medicine at UPenn, but the idea of there being a circulatory system involving the body's connective tissues was not unfamiliar to some medical systems. This knowledge is actually quite ancient, says Leah Welsh, an osteopathic physician and assistant professor of family and community medicine at Ohio State. It's something that other systems of medicine have been offering for a long time, but they didn't have microscopes. I actually find this statement kind of illuminating in the sense that I think a lot of Western medicine, or a lot of what is considered progress in Western medicine, ends up borrowing from more ancient traditions, but it just applies a framework of standardization. And then it becomes like legitimized in the eyes of Western medicine because as long as it's not able to be standardized or isolated and reproducible, as long as you can't eliminate that batch to batch variability, Western medicine tends not to like that because it wants something reliable, consistent, something where the dose is always the same. So I do think it's interesting how some of these concepts translate into our empirical framework. One of the most intriguing areas of current research is whether there's a connection between the interstitium and the ancient Chinese practice of acupuncture. Acupuncture is used to treat conditions as varied as chronic pain, migraines, seasonal allergies, and nausea caused by chemotherapy, but some of its actions have never been completely explained. The discovery of the interstitium may help us understand, in modern biomedical terms, how acupuncture works. The principles of the practice invoke two circulating elements, Qi and blood. I think it's supposed to be Qi and blood. Traditional Chinese medicine describes Qi as flowing along one of 12 main tracks called meridians. Acupuncturists insert small needles into specific points on the body to enhance the flow of qi. In a 2002 study, Helene Langevin and Jason Yandau mapped the locations of acupuncture points in the arms to the fascia between and around muscles. These acupuncture points have since been found to lie within the same areas of connective tissue where fluid flows through the interstitium. A 2019 paper by researchers in China, led by Dr. Hongyi Li, explains how they injected chemical tracers into acupuncture points in the hands and feet of cadavers and used chest compressions to push fluid through the bodies. Fluorescent photography enabled them to see the tracers traveling toward the heart within interstitial spaces of the arms and legs. Li and colleagues clearly recognized, just as well as Thies did, that they had glimpsed evidence of an interstitial circulation system. If acupuncture points seem to reside within the interstitium, could the meridians run through the interstitium as well? In 2021, a group of researchers conducted a similar experiment in China on living subjects, injecting dye into acupuncture points in the forearms of 15 volunteers. In almost all of them, the dye slowly migrated upward along a route corresponding to the pericardium meridian, which passes through the wrist and along the inner arm. Pericardium is the same meridian stimulated by anti-nausea wrist acupressure devices popular in cruise ships. This pathway doesn't go in the veins. It doesn't go superficially, says Andrew Ahn, studies senior author and an assistant professor at Harvard Med. It goes instead into the interstitium between the muscles. When I saw that, I said, we're onto something. This truly has to do with acupuncture. I actually do think the interstitium could be the link between Eastern and Western medicine, he said, but you have to show scientifically that that's the case. Much more research is needed to begin to understand the full implications of the discovery of an interconnected interstitium, but there are some promising leads. Research in animals led by Merrick suggests that when a person gains weight, specialized cells in the interstitium around body fat can be called upon to make healthy fat cells, which are a key factor in fending off type 2 diabetes. Tipping these specialized cells toward the production of more healthy fat could offer a target for potential diabetes therapies. Wells, who is gastroenterologist, says that interstitial links may help explain why some patients with IBD, particularly ulcerative colitis, develop an autoimmune disease that affects the bile ducts. It's been theorized that in inflammatory bowel disease, immune cells, gut bacteria, or bacterial fragments, I'm assuming they mean things like peptidoglycan or LPS, migrate from the intestines to the liver and end up reaching the bile ducts through the interstitium. So maybe like something like enterohepatic circulation happening there. An interconnected interstitium also seems to play a critical role in cancer metastasis. It's well established that cancer cells can spread to the rest of the body by hijacking the lymphatic system. It's interesting to see this mentioned because F-nucleatum or um, F-nucleatum is a strain of bacteria that is thought to play a causal role in colorectal cancer. It's one of the few associations that is not just correlation, but potentially causal. And it has been known to travel to distant organs as well. So it has been known to travel to the liver, to the bile ducts from the colon. And what's interesting is that its its presence in the colon might actually represent translocation from the oral cavity. That's still pretty speculative, but it could be said that the translocation from the oral cavity could be why it ends up there in some people. We're not 100% sure yet. A lot of this remains open to, a lot of this is just not completely well described or characterized yet. But evidence suggests that tumor cells may reach the lymphatic system by first navigating through the fluid, flowing through the interstitium like fish swimming downstream. Numerous cancer types have been spreading through the interstitium, breaking down hyaluronic acid as they spread. These include breast, lung, colon, pancreatic, and skin cancers, among others, according to these. A drug called narmafatinib, which disrupts how tumor cells invade and move through the interstitium, has shown promise in early clinical trials for treating pancreatic cancer when combined with chemotherapy. The discovery of a third circulatory system could transform our understanding of how the human body works, and it may also change how we view our own bodies in relation to other biological systems. Wells points out that hydra, tiny freshwater invertebrates, have fluid filled connective tissue called mesoglia that, like the interstitium, contain collagen and a gel like substance similar to hyaluronic acid. Plants seem to possess their own version of an interstitium too, called the apoplast, a type of interstitial space that transports water and nutrients outside cell membranes. These and other examples suggest that fluid moving through interstitial spaces might have represented the first circulatory systems to develop in the earliest forms of complex multicellular plant and animal life, hundreds of millions of years ago. This relatively recent discovery may have opened up new research frontiers that connect to some of the most ancient life forms on our planet. All right, I think that's the end of it. But yeah, I think just from like a network medicine standpoint, the interstitium is a really interesting concept in the sense that I think it could provide some of the scaffolding for why you do see a lot of comorbidities happen at a high frequency in some patients. So, for example, with going back to the connective tissue disorders like EDS, like Marfan syndrome, um, that affect the integrity of connective tissue, the interstitium could be the glue that is connecting things like connective tissue disorders to autonomic issues like dysautonomia, to immune issues like mast cell degranulation. I'm excited because I think this is something that's largely unexplored. But I think it's also interesting in the fact that if this is something that is just so pervasive throughout the body, um, could targeting it help with multiple different kinds of conditions at the same time? Um, like instead of having to build drugs for each specific target, could you potentially go for something that is a little bit more common, like commonality between all of these different things that co-occur in a lot of patients? Um, as far as like clinical trial recruitment goes, I think a lot of the time there is a desire to only recruit for patients who have one specific kind of phenotype of a condition, or just trying to make sure that there aren't any comorbidities, because a lot of the time researchers are afraid of just diluting signal with too much noise. And so they think we only want patients who have this one particular condition. And so if you have anything else going on, it might be under the exclusion criteria. But in the real world, patients are messy and they do have comorbidities, and sometimes at pretty high rates. And so I guess I'm hoping that if we were to have targets that were more common to multiple diseases, like hopefully we could move towards a framework where the efficacy in a trial is more reflective of the real world effectiveness of that drug once you're past the point of approval, when you're doing that post surveillance marketing. But obviously, this is me just thinking about things on a random Sunday evening. If anyone wants to join or have any thoughts of their own, feel free to let me know. I'm basically just speaking off the cuff, and yeah, I'm hoping that this becomes more of an attractive target. But I think at the same time, maybe it's a little bit too distributed for people to really get behind right now, because most of our drug development is based on genetic targets, meaning like we look at these genome-wide association studies or GWAS, and we think and we ask ourselves which the variation in which SNPs is, or like single nucleotide polymorphisms, is increasing the risk of a disease. And what does that gene encode for? Is it encoding for a protein? Is that protein misfolding? Maybe that's an attractive target. And so there's been this often quoted stat in medicine that drugs that have a genetic target based on these GWAS studies are 2 to 3 times more likely to succeed, or 2 to 3 times more likely to actually be effective in a patient population. But that's not to say that it's a hard requirement. So, just going back to the ecological framework and going back to what the interstitium is, not all of our targets need to have a genetic basis. So, for example, the most effective GI drug does not have a genetic target. And I'm talking about FMT, or fecal microbiota transplantation, for the treatment of recurrent C. diff. So, generally speaking, one of the biggest risk factors for developing C. difficile infection, which sometimes leads to colitis, is taking antibiotics. And there are some antibiotics that have a higher risk of developing C. diff than others. Generally speaking, the fluoroquinolones, clindamycin, those have a higher risk because they tend to be more broad spectrum. And FMT basically involves taking the gut microbes from a healthy person's stool and administering it to the person who has C. diff. This is often done via colonoscopy. I've also seen it done via rectal enema infusions, where they just take like a rectal catheter and deliver it that way. Um, but this tends to work on average 90 to 95% of the time for recurrent C. diff infection, compared to 30 to 40% of the time with antibiotics, which is the standard of care. So that would be something like a vancomycin. And the thing is, like the antibiotics, they're sometimes perpetuating the problem because you are still causing that sort of vacuum that allowed the C. difficile to proliferate in the first place. And this is like a purely ecological problem, right? There's not a genetic target for this, as far as we know. It's just that, when you take antibiotics, if you are already a carrier of C. difficile, um, wiping out those commensals can allow C. difficile to form biofilms, to start engaging in quorum sensing, and to actually gain a foothold in that environment. And so I think it's interesting in the sense that I think we're entering an era where the genetic framework might be overturned by something that is more ecological in nature, especially when you consider that most of our chronic diseases, the ones that have the highest burden, there is obviously an interaction between genes and the environment, and also probably the intestinal barrier. Um, Aless- Alessio Fasano, he is a professor of medicine at Harvard. He has always postulated that genes plus environmental trigger isn't sufficient for autoimmune disease. He believes that you also need loss of intestinal barrier function to develop a disease. And this is I believe, most validated for celiac, but um, he believes that unless you have translocation of things like LPS outside from the gut outside um, to other systems, neighboring systems, that it would not mount or trigger molecular mimicry in a systemic sense. And he was part of the team that developed larazotide. This was something that they wanted to test for celiac specifically. And so larazotide is a peptide that ends up closing or making sure that the tight junction proteins stay in the closed position. And it basically inhibits the release of zonulin, which keeps the tight junction proteins in the closed position. And so this is supposed to maintain barrier of the gut, maintain integrity of the gut. And the thing is, the peptide itself, I don't remember the name of the company that was making it, but they got past phase 1 and 2 trials, but they were not able to recruit enough patients, um, to be sufficiently powered for a phase 3 trial, and they ran out of runway before they could get there. But what's interesting is that larazotide ended up being repurposed for something called MISC, and MISC is a multi-inflammatory syndrome that happens in children. Um, some children who get exposed to COVID-19, and it's similar to sepsis, but it's not identical. But you do have similar elements in terms of cytokine storm. It can be very dangerous. It can lead to a lot of organ damage. And what was interesting was that in the trials where they used it for MISC, steroids alone were not enough to actually limit the inflammation and to bring the numbers of systemic cytokines down. But when you gave steroids alongside larazotide, that led to significantly improved outcomes. So there could be something there where perhaps like the integrity and function of the intestinal barrier could be a predisposing factor leading to autoimmunity, perhaps. I think it's definitely a really interesting area, something that deserves more research. But yeah, I guess I'm kind of encouraged that folks are thinking more in terms of systems and not just singular pathways, but networks and how things are created. Because um, I think it's nice if you can target something that is potentially modifiable, something that is potentially more upstream than than the symptoms that you're observing. And yeah, I'm excited. Okay, Invisible Together says fascia has been known in Chinese medicine for centuries. Yeah, I agree. I do think that this is something that a lot of other cultures have known about, and maybe they just have spoken about it in different terms. And I think it's also the fact of the matter that a lot of our knowledge remains undigitized. So I think there's probably quite a lot of knowledge in documents that either have not been translated or digitized. So I'd just would be interested to know about archival projects that might be going after that as well. But yeah, if anyone else has any thoughts, I would definitely be interested. But hope you're all having a good Sunday otherwise. Yeah, EDS, definitely. So I probably know the most about hypermobile EDS just because that's the thing that I'm afflicted by. What's interesting is that with other forms of EDS, like the vascular EDS or classical EDS, we do have a gene that we know about. With hypermobile EDS, we haven't nailed down a gene quite yet, but there has been research into this. So, for example, MUSC, the Norris lab there, and some of the work by a researcher named Courtney Gensimer. And so, yeah, she has done some research with the Norris lab on a potential gene that affects a protein called kallikrein. And that particular gene is involved in connective tissue formation. So I think I can't remember which percentage of the EDS patients had it. I think it might have been 33%, but don't quote me on it because I'm not 100% sure. But she had looked into this particular gene as part of her PhD project, and so I'm hoping eventually we'll have some translation. The other thing that I've seen is TNXB as a potential gene that could be responsible, which is also, again, part of connective tissue integrity. Um, yeah, I think so far, just because it hasn't been something validated across enough patients, we still don't have a gene target for HES, but I think it would help immensely to move the field forward because it feels like we're like one of the few that is still kind of looking for that answer, but it is relatively common. Um, I think I was kind of surprised to find out that that 1 in 5,000 statistic, it was actually just pulled out of a paper where a doctor was speculating. So when they said 1 in 5,000, it was pulled out of a opinion piece written by a doctor where he was basically just guessing. He said maybe 1 in 5,000. Um, Now that there have been more studies done on it, the estimate is probably a lot closer to 1 in 500, so a lot more common than we originally suspected. And I think hypermobile EDS is interesting in the sense that I feel like it occupies a little bit of a middle ground because in the United States, at least, in order for a disease to be characterized as rare, it has to affect fewer than 200,000 Americans. And it feels like hypermobile EDS is kind of stuck in this middle ground because it's not a rare disease by that definition. I mean, assuming people who had it were actually getting diagnosed. Um, but it's also not a neglected disease because that usually refers to the tropical diseases. And so I think a lot of these conditions have been characterized as complex chronic illness, but that's like not a recognized category yet. So it still feels like we're largely invisible, that we're largely unseen by the medical system. What do you think connects MCAS to the hypermobile EDS in terms of the immune system? Yeah, no, this is a great question. I do think that the connective tissue being unstable itself can be um, can be a connector, but I think this it could also be downstream of mitochondrial function um, in the sense that a lot of times when you have damage to mitochondrial structures, and obviously like mitochondrial dysfunction is a bit of a catch-all on its own, it doesn't tell you much because it's like, where is the dysfunction? Is it complex 1? Is it complex 2? Is it ATPase? What's happening? But I think when you're having damage to the mitochondrial membrane, when you're having like the release of cytochrome C cardiolipin, that those can also trigger mast cells to degranulate inappropriately. So I think some of it could be downstream of damage to mitochondrial membranes. I think a lot of it is downstream of like connective tissue itself not forming properly. Um, have more things that I would like to say, but brain fog is really messing with me today. But I think a lot of it is downstream of more more intracellular damage if I had to speculate on it. But as with anything, I think there's also vascular considerations. Um, Nitric oxide is interesting in the sense that it's a bit of a double edged sword. It can be an anti inflammatory thing in the sense that it promotes vasodilation, but I've also seen nitric oxide be something that can stimulate mast cell degranulation. So um, I think that, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But I would say also macrophage activation. Um, there's like two different phenotypes. There's M1 and M2, but even those you can divide into subtypes. And it feels like macrophage polarization could also be potentially playing a role. um, those are just some of my initial thoughts. I'm sorry, I think that was a bit scattered, but um, yeah, I think that there's a lot of shared pathobiology here to uncover and investigate. I think that the really frustrating thing for me is that, a lot of companies don't actually want to go after these patient populations just because there's a lot of heterogeneity. Um, Even though there's an ICD code, the patient population isn't recognized enough to be clearly defined. And it just feels like even if somebody wanted to, there's just like a lot of the barriers to actually being able to help this population. I am kind of excited about this one company though. Chondrion is the name, and it's their primary beachhead market is rare mitochondrial diseases, but they also dosed their first long COVID patient in one of their trials as well, because they do see some overlap between primary mitochondrial disease, those that a patient is born with, and secondary mitochondrial dysfunction like that in myalgic encephalomyelitis or long COVID. So I think they're one of the few exceptions. I think the other way that, drug development could get on board for some of these conditions is maybe if you were to validate it in one market and then open up a compassionate use program for other conditions. I think that's potentially another off ramp. But at the same time, it's like people are struggling now, and a lot of us have been bedbound and unable to work for decades. So I think it's just really unfair to ask people to wait when they're suffering. So I'm kind of hoping that drug repurposing and off-label prescribing gets to the point where we have some tools in our arsenal to help people today, right now, instead of just saying, "Oh, come back when we have a trial." Because I honestly feel like that answer is really inhumane. But yeah, I think that's all I've got for now. And yeah, thanks for spending some of your Sunday evening with me.